Now let's start getting into something that is a little bit more recognizable as comics as you would think of them. The earliest examples that we would recognize today, they're from the late 19th century. Now, of course, there's other examples, but I'm going to go with this because this simplifies it a bit. Newspapers ran comics in order to attract readers. Now, I realize if I'm talking to a young audience, newspapers were these things where you would read the news on paper. Uh, Anyway, they ran the comics, and the reason why they called them comics was due to the fact that they typically dealt with humorous subject matter. So it's because of that the name is stuck. So even though you can have a comic, really great comic I read recently, it told the story of the detective who brought in the Green River Killer. Really powerful piece of work. It's not funny at all. It's very serious subject matter. I mean, it's based on a true story, but still, I call it a comic because back in the late 19th century, that's the 1800s, for those of you who get confused with that, that's because back then, they got saddled with that name, and it just kind of stuck. So there you go. And the thing is, you need to realize, too, is nowadays, not nearly as many people get the newspaper as they used to, even when I was growing up. No, I did not grow up in the late 19th century. But newspapers, before television, they were, basically people's main way of getting the news. And there were, like, a major city would have several newspapers, and they would compete with each other. And their comics were always a popular section. And they would run various comics to compete with the other newspapers because if people liked one particular strip over another, they would buy that paper instead. This image you see right here is from a very influential comic strip called Crazy Cat. You may have never heard of it before, but if you've ever enjoyed a comic strip ever in your life, it owes a debt to Crazy Cat. Like I said, very influential, and unfortunately, I got to move on and talk about some other stuff. Some of these characters from these early days of comics, one of the first recurring character was the Yellow Kid, and he was created by Richard Felton Outcalt in 1895. I'll be honest with you, I have seen some of these old strips with the Yellow Kid. Perhaps if I was raised in the inner city in the late 19th century amongst German, Polish, Jewish immigrants, I would find it hilarious, but I wasn't, so I don't get it. I don't know what's funny about it, but if we're going to talk about comics, you got to talk about the Yellow Kid. He was such a popular character. And there's like I said, a whole complex history behind him. Different newspapers try and compete. They try to create their own equivalent to the Yellow Kid, a lot of copycats. So he's really important in that regard, even though you probably have never heard of him. I doubt they're going to try and bring him back in any kind of significant way. I don't think they're going to make like a big, Marvel-sized movie based on the Yellow Kid. Probably a good thing that they don't do that. But anyway, that was the first one where he was recurring, and people would buy the paper to see this character. Technically speaking, I'm kind of cheating here, because most of the Yellow Kid strips was just a one-panel gag, which means it's not technically a comic. It's not sequential art that actually makes it a cartoon if it's just a one-panel gag. Let's not get too hung up on that, but there's one of my many tangents for you. The first thing that would be a little bit more recognizable as a comic strip that's actually incorporating sequential art. Again, I've explained to you why the Tomb of Mena and the Codex Natal are essentially the same thing as comics, but you never would. Had I not told you that, you probably wouldn't have made that connection. The oldest thing I could probably show you, or one of the oldest things I could show you, would be the Katzenjammer Kids. If you saw that, you would say, yeah, that's a comic strip. Creator Rudolf Dirk's strip, it started in 1897. It used actual sequential art rather than just the one-panel gag of the Yellow Kid, and dialogue balloons. And that was, and to use those regularly and effectively, that was pretty revolutionary. It was pretty cutting edge. Next up, Little Nemo in Slumberland. Winsor McCay's creation from 1905 was one example of a strip that would take up an entire page of the newspaper and feature elaborate artwork. Now, here's the thing, everybody. Again, not many people get the newspaper anymore. I mean, honest, I read all my news online. I haven't gotten the funniest page. I haven't looked at it in quite a while. Last time I looked at it, honestly, guys, it's a travesty. Um, I'm not trying to say that there aren't talented people doing comic strips. By all means, that's not true. There are definitely some wonderfully talented people. But last I saw, they would put, maybe on the front page, they put 4 or 5 comic strips on there. And then on the inside pages, they'd have 7, 8 comic strips. Some of them they would chop up and, run them instead of horizontally, they run them vertically, and they would shrink them down real small. So it really limits the artist as to what type of art they can do. You got to go with a lot of simple lines, things that look okay when they're shrunken down. And of course, you can create some wonderful stuff that way. But it's very limiting because not every artist works like that. And Winsor McCay, they gave him the entire page of the comic strip. So he could go nuts. He could do whatever he wanted. If he wanted to have, as you see in the image there, if he wanted to have a giant circle for a panel in the middle, he could do that. If he wanted to have, a bunch of long vertical panels that went all the way from the top of the page down to the bottom of the page, he could do that. He could do whatever he wanted. But the comics artists nowadays, they're often told by the syndicates, the people who run them in the paper, that they have to have a certain number of panels, that the first panel has to feature the title, which you could see that Winsor McCay did there. Needs to feature the title, and it has to follow certain dimensions. Needs to have the title and sort of a throwaway gag, because some newspapers will run that little title box and some won't. So it can't be related to everything else that's going on. And then you need to, draw everything within the certain, certain aspect ratio. So that way, if the paper wants to run it horizontally, they can run it horizontally. If they want to run it vertically, they can run it vertically. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Calvin and Hobbes. They will show up much, much later in these notes. But one of the reasons why Bill Watterson quit doing Calvin and Hobbes is because he was really stifled by the newspapers who, he wanted to let loose like this, but the newspapers didn't allow it. Anyway, we'll get more to Watterson and all that later. Let's go a little bit further. By the mid-1920s, adventure strips became more and more popular. Many of these strips featured a more realistic style of artwork, as the humans had realistic proportions and features. This right here is, I believe, from the first action adventure strip called Wash Tubbs. I don't know much about it. Honestly, I'd never heard about it until I started doing this research. But basically, these strips would end on a cliffhanger. And again, newspapers, one of the ways they get people to read them, not just for the news, but were their comic strips. And these action adventure strips would, they'd be to be continued from one to the next. So if you bought that paper and you read that strip and you got to the end of it and you're like, I want to know what happens next, you're going to buy that paper again the next day. Again, very cutthroat, very competitive business back then. Some of the notable examples of this time period would include, Buck Rogers in the 25th century. The character was originally created for a short story, a prose, by Philip Francis Nolan. But then they converted it into a comic strip. It was drawn by various creators over the years. That image right there, I'm not sure exactly when it's from, but I know enough about the art styles to know that that's not 1920s art style, maybe 1970s, perhaps 80s, somewhere around there. But various people would draw it over the years, and it would go on to become one of the most influential works of science fiction. Now, if you like science fiction at all, the stuff you like was, even if you've never heard of Buck Rogers, it was either inspired by Buck Rogers or inspired by something that was inspired by Buck Rogers. I know that George Lucas, when he created Star Wars, he was definitely inspired by Buck Rogers, and Star Wars has gone on to inspire pretty much every bit of science fiction, especially sci-fi fantasy that has come out since then. So, very, very influential story. Influential character. You may not have heard of him. When I was a little kid, when I was, maybe kindergarten, first grade, I had a Buck Rogers toy because there was a TV show. Keep in mind, we're talking about the 1920s here. I was a little kid in the late 70s, early 80s. So he was still popular for several decades, and they would recreate him and re-envision the character and the story. I would not be surprised if there's some movie studio executive discussing the potential of a new Buck Rogers movie, or perhaps a Buck Rogers TV show or something. I'm sure somebody owns that property, and they're going to try and do something with it, perhaps in your lifetime. Whether it'll be successful or not, I don't know. I know they've had some false starts over the years. But the point is this: if you've never heard of him, you've heard of things that were inspired by him, by this creation. The basic premise is it featured a World War I veteran. And I don't know if you don't know when World War I is, that's 1914 to 1918. So this was, the recent war for the original audience here. And he fell into suspended animation, this veteran of the First World War, only to be awakened 500 years later. And he had to fight to free America from the Mongol hordes that had taken over. Now, if your racism senses are tingling, that's because there is a bit of a racist undercurrent to this. In the United States, I would love to say that prejudice and racism against Asians and Asian Americans is a thing of the past. Unfortunately, it's not. Back then, it was much more overt, though. It was, called the Yellow Peril, and many Americans were afraid of immigrants coming from Asian countries, particularly East Asian, China and Japan, Korea. Probably mostly the Chinese, what they were concerned with. Mongol, of course, is referring to Mongolia. I don't know how many people from Mongolia we had, but anyway, it's all associated with that same basic area of geography. People were afraid, and so there was a lot of very open prejudice and open hostility, and this was playing into that fear. It's like America's been taken over by the Mongol hordes. Now, realize with this character, you can reinvent him and get rid of this subtle bit of racism, or it's actually not subtle. You can get rid of this bit of racism. If you see the picture there, you're like, that doesn't look like any Asian person I've ever met. Certainly doesn't look like any Asian person I've ever met either. In the retellings of Buck Rogers, the Earth is taken over by alien beings and alien species. So you can still have the basic concept where he wakes up far into the future without, singling out a particular ethnic group, and having that. So you can just have the aliens from outer space. Of course, if ever aliens from outer space actually do come and visit us, they're going to be like, hey, why are we the bad guys of the story? But we'll worry about that when we actually make contact with them.